This webinar is being recorded, and hi everybody, good afternoon. This is Deb Eldridge, and I hope you can hear me. Yes, thank you, Phyllis. Phyllis just wrote and said, yes, we can hear you. I believe there was a problem earlier, so I had to disconnect and get back online, and I think we have that problem solved, which is great. Okay, so we're going to get our webinar started. Most of you look like your old-time webinar attendees. I see that you've all muted your phones. Just do remember, if you want to speak up, please unmute your phone. If you want to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat like Phyllis just did. However, address it to me as the host. Okay, in the past, some folks have, I think, addressed questions to all participants, and I haven't gotten them for some reason. And so don't want you to feel that your questions are being ignored. They're not, but I certainly can't answer a question I can't see. So please address it to me as the host. You can also, I think you have a feature where you can raise your hand. And occasionally I have interspersed this webinar with little feedback and question pauses. And so those will give me a chance to check the chat and check whether there are any hands that are raised, and I'll call on you accordingly. The PowerPoint will be posted as a PDF in the on the website, actually. Let me change this, okay? On the website. As will a recording of this webinar. You can find it under accreditation resources. That's where you'll find past webinars, and this one will be posted in a couple days after we finish. All right, we're going to get started. Today we're focusing on case studies. And what the goal is here is to talk about how case studies, okay, can be used, okay, in the self-study for CAPE for your accreditation. And hopefully, by the end of this webinar, you'll be able to talk about the pros and the cons of case study from the perspective of the accreditor, respond to evidence questions about a case study, and be able to apply the criteria for evidence quality to a case study. And so those are the three general areas that we'll be focusing on today. So let's get started on the pros and cons. And this is from the perspective of the accreditor, of CAPE. And the pros are pretty general to case studies themselves. They really can give you some very fine-grained insights into what your completers or employers, whoever you're focusing your case study on, however people are perceiving your programs and the strengths and perhaps areas for improvement in those programs. They can definitely provide a wide range of advice if you were to do case study of a particular aspect of your programs and select to focus on observing candidates in the classroom, for example. They can give you a wide range of evidence on candidate performance depending on how you've structured and planned your case study. Case studies are really good for serving as a catalyst for further study. They can unearth things that normally you wouldn't have been aware of, and so will give you a lot of possibilities for follow-up after the case study is completed. And those can then, in turn, be used to initiate program improvements and further program development. And, of course, that is one of the general priorities of CAPE, is this idea of continuous improvement, no matter what pathway you're pursuing for accreditation. However, there are some cons in the use of case study, and these cons are from an accreditor's perspective. Is if the design is of the study itself is poor. For example, the purpose for conducting the case study has not been thoughtfully, let's say, defined. And then and if so, then the opportunities for taking action as a result of the case studies are something that CAPE is concerned about. And thirdly, the use of a convenience rather than a purposeful sampling. And these are all design considerations for case study. Often, I think in case study that I've been involved with in the past, either as a faculty member or as an administrator, in a teacher preparation program, we've kind of relied on the folks that we knew we had access to, and this is the convenience sample, as opposed to purposeful sampling where we determine what it is we want to our purpose of our case study and how we want to be able to use our results. That's the actionability part. And then sort of design who we're going to be working with or including as participants in the case studies based on the purpose of the study itself. And so that's something that CAPE is going to be looking at, and we'll talk a little bit later about the criteria for evaluation of case studies. And then last of all is this generalizing findings inappropriately. A CAPE staffer remarked to me that the limitations for a case study get defined really early on, but what often happens when the conclusions are being drawn and the analysis is being conducted is that often there is a tendency to be a little broader in our application of the findings than we would have been if we had paid close attention to our limitations in the beginning. And so just something to be considered. Those of you that do case study as a methodology in your own scholarship are not going to find any of this surprising. However, I think it is somewhat surprising to find that CAPE is looking at case study as a real opportunity for accreditation evidence. And so we'll go a little further in a minute on our next slide to talk about where case studies are going to be specifically called out by CAPE. And the accreditation handbook, if you look into that, you'll find that case study is mentioned in component 3.2, which is on selectivity and admissions. And it suggests that case study might be a viable way to investigate your selectivity at admissions. Also in 3.3, in the use of other criteria in admissions, and as you know, CAPE criteria include GPAs and scores on nationally normed tests, but CAPE has admitted that there are many other criteria that can be used in admissions, and component 3.3 is your opportunity to talk about those criteria and to submit evidence. And so this is an opportunity as well where case study is something that CAPE has acknowledged right up front would be a useful way to look at those other criteria that you use for admissions. Case study can also be used in 4.3 and 4.4, which have to do with satisfaction of candidates and employers. So for example, they do say employer satisfaction or candidate satisfaction can be determined through surveys, but they can also use a case study approach to investigate further how the candidates and employees are feeling about your program. So when you look at the accreditation handbook, you see these four components in which case studies are called out specifically. However, if you look at the evidence guide, there's some additional components that are called out, and one includes 3.6, which is another component under the selectivity component that talks about professional responsibility. And the evidence guide suggests that looking into how your candidates are prepared in terms of the professional responsibilities of the field, their ethics, etc., could be a useful place to utilize case study approach. It also talks about using case study in 4.1 and 4.2. 4.1 is completer impact on P12 learning. And I'll share with you in a minute a handout that was shared at the CAPE conference that talks about the way that a teacher candidate, no, not teacher candidate because we're talking about completers, how a teacher can do a case study in her own classroom. And that, too, can be used as evidence of completer impact on P12 learning in the absence of, let's say, growth models or other data that might be available. If it's not available, then case study may be some approach that you would like to adopt. And then, too, in terms of 4.2, which is about teaching effectiveness, often when CAPE talks about the teaching effectiveness component, it's talking about teacher observations or let's say, employer observations of teachers or their giving tenure to teachers, something that looks at teaching effectiveness from the perspective of their teaching skills, not from the perspective of student achievement. And so CAPE is suggesting in the evidence guide that you could also use case study as an approach to getting at teacher effectiveness. But the most important thing I think I learned from talking to CAPE staffers in preparation for this webinar was that case study does not need to be explicitly listed for you to be able to use it as a basis for your evidence submission. And what was pointed out to me was that it's really the logic of an approach. What is it? How is it that case study could be a way for you to get at some of the nuances of a particular standard or component, and that you should think about case study not just in terms of what CAPE has stated, oh, you can use it here, you can use it there, but to think of ways that you feel that case study would be an appropriate approach for you. And so some of the examples that the CAPE staffers also pointed out were the use of case study for 1.4 for curricular alignment, for documenting the depth and the breadth of clinical practice. Let's say comparing, doing case studies of different candidates in different forms of clinical experiences and talking about which of those experiences appears to be providing the most effective preparation for candidates. And it talks about, and they also suggested that 3.4 is where you need to talk about your candidate progress at 2 or more points, and that case studies would be an effective way for you to do that as well, by looking at a number of candidates across different progress points over time and how they developed their skills in effective teaching. Okay, and also 5.3, and 5.3, as you may know, relates to the quality assurance system and is the point at which a transformation or a particular innovation in an approach should be tested and can be tested, and so case study might be appropriate here as well. So on the next slide, I believe I'm going to stop talking for a minute and ask if there are any questions. As I look at the chat right now, I don't see any questions that have come up and been typed in, and as I look at the attendee list, I don't see anybody with their hand raised right now. But I am going to pause, and if you have a question, please speak up. Just remember to unmute yourself, please. Okay. Hearing no questions being raised, I'm going to continue on. So far we've talked about the pros and cons of approaches, and we've talked about where it is the case study can be used or is suggested to be used by CAPE and how they're thinking about case study. So here in the Accreditation Handbook, and I'm giving you my reference right here, Accreditation Handbook Glossary, page 119, and let me pop that right up on your screen for you. There it is, a definition of case study. And so you can see that they're looking at case study as a systematic study of some aspect of your preparation. And that in doing so, you're going to posit a problem of practice. You're going to identify a means to address that problem. You're going to frame the measures that you're going to use, gather the data, and analyze the results. And it says, for the purposes of program improvement or accreditation evidence. So that's CAPE's straightforward definition of what a case study is. And here we have it outlined on the slide as well. And I think we need to talk about a systematic study. I think that sometimes in our efforts to complete our self-studies and to provide the accreditor with as much information as we possibly can to prove that we're meeting standards, that sometimes we can put together evidence that is on hand. And what CAPE is looking forward to in terms of case study is really that it is a systematic study, that it's been thoughtfully identified of what it is you want to find out more information about, and how you're going to go about addressing that problem of practice through a case study approach. Okay. So these are questions that you should consider if you're planning a case study. And as you know, for those of you that are hosting your visits in fall 2016 or later, at least through 2017, plans and progress on those plans can be submitted as part of your case study, as part of your self-study. So these are some questions to consider. If right now you're sort of thinking about, well, gosh, where would a case study help to complete a set of evidence related to a particular standard or a component. And so maybe right now, for those of you having visits in 2016, 2017, you really can now in 2015 go about designing that case study and getting it underway. And then when your self-study is submitted, you would talk about what your plan has been and how far along you are in initiating its implementation. So these are some points that appear in the evidence guide on pages 28 and 29. And I'm going to call up the evidence guide right now. And you can see on pages, well, this is page 27 because that is where the heading on case studies begins, right there. So if you haven't looked at the evidence guide yet, you'll see that it does talk about case study. And it talks about ways in which or when case study can be used. And then on 28 and 29, this is where you get into some of the specifics about how CAPE is looking at case study and what are the kinds of questions that it would be expecting to be addressed. So I've synthesized that into these areas. Sort of how was your topic of study identified? Okay, they're going to expect here that there's some kind of a problem statement. Remember that the CAPE definition included that you've identified a problem of practice that you feel that a case study approach will help you to solve in some way. So there is the problem statement that you will be making. That they're going to expect that you have conducted some kind of a literature review and found what have other people already discovered about this topic, this particular problem of practice. And then they're going to be looking at the measurability of what you've defined. Can you really get at the problem you've identified? They're going to be looking at how were ideas for change generated. And in this, they're expecting that there will be some stakeholder involvement. What was the process you used? What was your theoretical framework? How were stakeholders engaged in defining the case study and design of the case study? And these are the kinds of, this is where some of the CAPE components begin to overlap, because one of the components in your quality assurance system asks specifically about stakeholders. And so here is where a case study can be submitted as evidence, let's say for candidate, completer teaching effectiveness, okay? But you could also submit it as evidence for stakeholder involvement if you have engaged them from the ground floor in talking through the case study and how to approach it. Okay, how CAPE is going to be looking for you to talk a bit about how were the measurements defined, that there was a purposeful selection, that it was aligned with the problems to be addressed, that you've identified those limitations. And remember, we talked earlier about how limitation definition up front should also be played out when you start talking about the results, okay? And then Tony Bright talks about a plan for unintended consequences. So, you know, all of us do, we've been through the dissertation phase of our lives and know that there's so many unintended consequences that come up when we're conducting a study. And so what CAPE is looking for here is what are the unintended consequences that, you know, an unintended consequence is an unintended consequence, but there are some things that you could identify up front. You know, what if people drop out? What if, you know, school is interrupted? But, you know, there could be a whole myriad of things that you could consider up front about what complications might be, and can you develop some sort of plan for those things should they happen. Next, CAPE is going to look about how will these solutions be tested. And if you remember in the definition of the case study, CAPE talked about the approaches or the solutions that you would identify. And so here you're talking about, okay, what's going to work for us? Who are we going to address? Under what conditions? Okay, to try to get at a solution to that problem of practice. Okay, and then the last two parts of what CAPE is looking at are really sort of the beyond the case study. Okay, how are these solutions going to be sustained and scaled? So let's say, for example, you've done a study of teaching effectiveness of your completers that are 2 and 3 years out of your programs, and you've discovered in your case studies that there appears to be a need for further strengthened preparation, let's say, in working with special needs, learners with special needs. And this is pretty standard for beginning teachers who feel that they need more practice and more preparation in how to address the needs of all learners. And so that's why I pick it as an obvious alternative. If that's found, then how can we, what are the solutions that we can propose to that? And then how can we scale those solutions up? And that would be a part of your case study, is to talk, okay, from our case study, here's what we've identified, here's how we're going to implement this, here's how we're going to follow through on that and scale up. And then last of all, how is your knowledge going to be shared? How are you going to be informing the respondents of your case study? How are you going to get back to them? How will you share the knowledge that you've gained from the case study with your stakeholders who are involved from the very beginning? So these areas right here are the areas that also appear in the evidence guide on pages 28 and 29. And when you're designing your case study, it would be good to think about how you would frame your responses to these questions in your self-study. So it's kind of a heads up. All right, I'm going to take another minute here to pause and check on my chat and check on participants to see if anybody has a question. I don't see any hands up yet, but I don't need to call on you. You can feel free to speak up. Okay, let me pull down my chat screen. I don't see any questions having been entered into the chat either. Please remember, if you do enter a question in the chat, please direct it to me as the host. And if for some reason I'm not reading your question and you've submitted one, call me on it, please. Just speak up. Okay, so I'm going to be quiet for another few minutes and see if we have any takers for questions at this point. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our very next slide. Here's where I guess the rubber meets the road in terms of case study for accreditation purposes, is how is CAPE going to be evaluating a case study? And this is where I've referenced 2 points: the evidence guide from pages 22 to 25, and the CAPE assessment rubric. And we're going to be looking at sections 1, 2, 3, and finally section 9. Because this is, when I spoke at length with CAPE staff about case study, you'll find that in the final assessment rubric, there isn't a rubric for a case study, okay? And so what CAPE staff told me was that they'll be using, that people should refer to the general rubric. This is available on the CAPE website under resources, and look under accreditation resources on the new website. And the first part of what the evaluators will be looking at is what is the purpose and the use for the instrument or for the case study. So that's why I've said, what's the purpose and use of the case study, okay? They want to know, are the pointer points when the instrument was administered during preparation explicit? So if you are using case study as a methodology on candidate performance and progress, they're going to want to know when the case study points were administered. and what's the purpose of the instrument, and how is it going to be used, okay, in either monitoring candidates or making decisions on progress. And then, I think this is extremely important, of course, is to be very explicit about what standards or components of the standards the case study has been designed. And I'm only looking here at level 3 because this is where you want to be. You want to be at a level 3 because this says you're meeting the minimum criteria that is necessary to support a CAPE evaluation, concluding that the self-study data are likely to meet CAPE standards and evidence guidelines. So this is your sort of target right here. And then level 4 will get you into going beyond the minimum criteria that CAPE has established. Okay, and you should look at this rubric to see sort of where you fall in that. The next area that CAPE will be looking at is how was the case study developed. So we go back to that rubric and we look at category 2, which is on instrument development, okay? So here you can see that if we stay right at level 3, which is the basic level at which you can conclude that there is sufficient evidence to meet the CAPE standard, that what you've done is to provide a detailed description of how that case study was developed, how it is integrated with preparation curriculum. So your case study has targeted candidate progress and performance throughout the program in the area of, let's use the same example I used before, on how to prepare candidates for teaching learners with special needs, for example. And then, again, I pointed it out before, are those stakeholders involved? And here, CAPE is expecting that to be minimally acceptable to CAPE, that the case study was developed with preparation provider and clinical faculty involved. Okay, and if you notice at the higher level, it says that these stakeholders were involved at multiple stages. So you can see as you go through this sort of what the expectations might be and how you might continue to design your case study to meet those expectations. So the last, the third area, not the last, but certainly the third area is how are candidates and stakeholders informed? And so the rubric talks about information for respondents, and we talked about that earlier. How are the respondents or the participants in the case study, how are they given a description of what you were going to do and how you were going to proceed with the case study and what its purpose was? Okay, and given them instructions about what they were expected to do and what the basis for your judgments would be, okay? This is information to respondents. I would go a step further in connecting this with that stakeholder involvement issue that I mentioned before, in that how are you going to be sharing the knowledge that you gain from the case study? This is sort of the pre-doing your case study is informing participants or respondents about their involvement and what you're going to do and their confidentiality, et cetera, et cetera. There's also sort of the post areas, how you're going to be sharing the results of that with those that participated. Okay, let me go on to category 9. And I got to drag it way down here to almost the end. It's on page 9. It's category 9 on page 9 of 11, and it talks about instrument validity. So let me go back to my PowerPoint. These were in talking to CAPE staff, they said, look, we need to know what the purpose and use of the case study is, who developed it, how it was developed, and then the expectation is for case study, as with any of the instruments that you use to provide evidence for your self-study, that these instruments are meeting the criteria for quality evidence. So this is where we get into CAPE assessment rubric, category 9. And in this category, it talks about the instrument validity, okay? And you can see right here that a description or plan is provided that details the steps that you've taken to ensure the validity of that case study, okay? and that it was developed drawing on research. Remember, I talked earlier about the need to have conducted some kind of a literature review. Okay, and here's where it comes into play, that the case study was not developed in a vacuum, that it was developed drawing upon research, and what makes for a quality case study. It was piloted prior to admission, and certainly with case study, you know, it helps to maybe, if you've included a set of informal questions or focus groups or something in your case study, that those kinds of questions have been piloted in some form, okay, and that you are detailing your plans for analyzing and interpreting the results. And then it goes on into instrument reliability, and the rubric here can give you some good information about the kinds of things that you would want to consider in designing your case study related to reliability. Okay, I want to also share with you something from the CAPE Evidence Guide. Let me continue with my PowerPoint. In the Evidence Guide on pages 16 to 21, and this is particularly relevant for case study, are these criteria for quality evidence. And these were designed, or this comes from a paper by Peter Ewell, who wrote this paper actually for CAPE. I'm going to go to those pages now. Let me get up to, here we go. We're on actionability. Let me just get back to each one of those criteria. There we go. Okay. Each one of these principles, it's section 5 in the Evidence Guide, are principles of good evidence. And so what these pages do, let me go back to my PowerPoint quickly, on pages 16 to 21 in the Evidence Guide, are to lay out sort of CAPE's perspective on what it means to have high quality evidence. Certainly the validity and reliability issues that are included in the rubric, but there are other criteria as well, one being relevance, okay? Is the evidence that you're submitting, is the case study, how is the case study that you're going to submit relevant? Is it representative, and in what ways is it representative, and what ways is it not, okay? Cumulativeness, how is this contributing to other forms of evidence that you're submitting that substantiates you're meeting the standards. So each one of these 10 criteria that appear here on my PowerPoint are investigated or described in depth on pages 16 to 21 of the Evidence Guide. And I'd suggest that this might be a very useful exercise of professional development to go through and look at each one of these criteria in relation to a case study that you might submit as part of your self-study. Where this gets really interesting are in the appendix, pages 36 to 38, also of the Evidence Guide. Let me pull that Evidence Guide up again and go to page 36 and show you what I mean. What happens in the appendix, let me see here, there we go, okay. What happens in this appendix is that each one of those 10 criteria of good evidence are addressed from the perspective of typical types of evidence that might be submitted. And so, for example, let's go to validity and reliability. And what Peter Ewell did for CAPE here is to say, okay, there are 3 kinds of evidence that might be pretty typically submitted for a self-study. Licensure pass rates are clearly something that must be included in your self-study. Employment rates are also something that CAPE is looking for in the self-study. And voila, case studies is one that he uniquely calls out and relates each one of these forms of evidence to the criteria that are important for evidence quality. So you can see here in terms of validity and reliability that it's quite straightforward in saying case studies can be a bit more problematic, okay, because their validity depends on the type of information collected and the extent to which the procedures are used across cases and over time, and that this will be a peer judgment on the part of the reviewers. But in each one of these criteria, you can see in this appendix how a case study is either strong or weak in regard to each one of these criteria. And by looking across these, if you're planning to do a case study or you've got a case study underway and you expect to be submitting a case study as part of your evidence, then you can look here and talk about some of the strengths and perhaps limitations or challenges of case study in relation to the quality of evidence. So let's look at relevance, for example. One of the things that CAPE has often said is that relevance, one way to establish relevance is to talk about the relationship of the approach, instrument, assessment, case study to the standard itself. And so here, in the case study example, Ewell is suggesting that relevance is established by relating specifically to an important dimension of program performance. So to go back to our example of looking at candidate performance on meeting the needs of learners with special needs, okay, meeting the needs of all learners, that would be an important dimension of program performance and highly relevant, okay, to your self-study and to the evidence and to meeting the standard. So there you go. I would suggest that if you're considering submitting a case study, to spend some time on this appendix. Would be time well spent. And again, that appears on pages 36 to 38 of the evidence guide. Okay, let's go on. All right, I'm going to pause now. This is our final feedback and question pause. I've been talking for almost 40 minutes straight without questions or interruption, and I think it's time for somebody to interrupt me with a question or a comment. So please tell me what questions I can answer for you now. Anybody? Okay. I'm going to pop up here. I promised you I'd share this with you. And this is a handout from the CAPE conference in which they discussed Standard 4 and how to, as you know, Standard 4, you must meet Standard 4 in order to be accredited, fully accredited. And so one of the suggestions was that your data from completers in-service teachers could be teacher action research. In the absence of having district or state data on student achievement, whether that's value-added or growth models, teacher action research can also be submitted, and CAPE would consider this to be a case study. Okay, and you can see here what the criteria would be for that. They'd expect to participating teachers would make summary records available, okay, on certain aspects of student performance. And that this design could meet CAPE's criteria or expectation for data on completers in teacher classrooms. So an important way that case study can be used when that case study is being generated from the teacher rather than from the EPP. Okay. All right. Well, in the absence of questions, here's where we're going next. You will get a survey, a feedback survey mailed to you on June 1st. And these are our next 4 webinars. On June 4th, At 1 in the afternoon, Eastern Daylight Time, we'll talk about portfolios. On June 16th, we're going to be talking about drafting plans as a part of the self-study. And I just today finished a conference call with CAPE staff to make sure we were all on the same page about what plans can be submitted as part of the self-study. On July 7th, we're going to talk about planning your evidence submissions, and on July 16th, we're going to talk about those self-study evidence questions that you should be prepared to answer when you submit evidence as a part of your case study or your self-study. So I'm going to be hanging out here for at least the next 5 minutes or so. If anybody has a question, just speak up. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending our webinar today on case studies, and I hope this isn't what you look like right now, sound asleep on your desk, as adorable as it is. It's intended to be a little joke for you. Okay, so I'm going to hang out here in case a question comes up, and I look forward to speaking with you. Don't see any hands up. And I don't see any chat questions. So I'll wait. Anybody? Nope. Okay, people are logging out. Got about 4 or 5 people left. Anybody with a question? Nope. Okay, well, thank you all for being here. I see we have a couple of attendees left. Either of you have a question for me? I think I see Cindy and Sue on there. Nope. Okay. Well, thank you, and I will stop recording right now.